All right, so let's go ahead and we won't take time to elicit responses because we want to make sure we stay on track, but this is the figure I often use to introduce backward course design. It is not me, but it does kind of look like me when I was a kid. So what the idea is here is that we're beginning with the end in mind. So if we begin at the end, and this is a quote that I saw that I think encapsulates the sort of whole idea of backward design. So it comes from Alice in Wonderland. Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? That depends a good deal on where you want to get to, said the cat. I don't much care where, said Alice. Then it doesn't matter which way you go, said the cat. So the idea there is that we want to make sure that our students understand where we're going. It's important for us to understand where we're going in order to create instructional activities that help students get to where they need to be. So that's sort of the essence of backward design. So we begin by identifying the desired results. What should students know, understand, or be able to do? Okay? Then we determine what is acceptable evidence. What will convince you that the students know something, understand something, or are able to do something? Then, once we've identified those two things, then we plan the learning experiences. So if we know where we want to get our students to a certain place, and we know what evidence we're going to use to determine whether they've gotten to that place, what are the activities that they should engage in? What are the activities that I should share with them to help them get to that goal? Then we implement, we collect, and we interpret the data. So sometimes when I first started talking about backward design in workshops, I had this linear representation of it. It shouldn't be linear. It should be circuitous. We need to implement, we need to find out, are the students learning? If they are learning, great. If they aren't learning, or if there are folks, some folks who are learning and some folks who are not learning, what can we do to change the instructional activities to make sure that we're giving the students the best opportunity to achieve the learning objectives? So this is another representation of the same thing. This comes from D. Fink's work on backward course design. We have our learning outcomes and objectives, we have our feedback and assessment, our teaching and learning activities, and what we want to do at all times is make sure these are aligned. Are the learning outcomes actually what I want my students to be learning? Are the assessments actually assessing whether or not the students have achieved those learning objectives? And do these activities actually help students try to achieve them? So it goes back to that feedback loop. Are we making sure all of these are aligned? Are we using the data collected from the assessments to drive instructional decisions? And in D. Fink's model, he talks about situational factors. This doesn't occur in a vacuum. What you can do in a 250-person course is very different than what you can do in a 30-person course. So we have to think about situational factors. Who are the students? What are their characteristics? What are their incoming abilities? Those sorts of things go into this overall view of backward course design. So today we're going to focus on the learning objectives and the assessments, and specifically applying those to three-dimensional learning. So Melanie Cooper was supposed to present this, but she wasn't here, so hopefully she trusts me to present this, because we're going to keep moving on. So three-dimensional learning is an approach that is part of the AAU STEM Initiative project that was started here at MSU, and Melanie Cooper is the PI for that project. That has expanded now to an NSF IUS grant that my co-presenters are part of that grant as well. And so this is something that we're trying to think about as we consider what our students need to be doing. So it comes from the framework for STEM education that was authored by the National Research Council. And this quote sort of encapsulates what that framework is about. The framework is designed to help realize a vision for education in the sciences and engineering in which students over multiple years of school actively engage in scientific and engineering practices and apply cross-cutting concepts to deepen their understanding of the core ideas in these fields. So we're going to briefly talk about what each of those things are. What are scientific and engineering practices, what are cross-cutting concepts, and what are core ideas? And then we use that to frame the development of learning outcomes and assessments. So this approach is called three-dimensional learning because there's 3 dimensions. And the idea is that you want to blend these dimensions together. The idea is that students ought to be learning all of these at the same time. And that's what I'm going to step you through here. So the core ideas are what we want students to know. What are those big ideas in the discipline, enduring ideas that we want students to know? Science practices are what we want students to do with that knowledge. We don't want students just to memorize it. What do we actually want them to do with that knowledge? And then the cross-cutting concepts are how they connect these ideas to other disciplines. And this is something that I think many of us who are involved in this project have really come to understand a little bit better as we talk to people outside of our discipline. Our project is interdisciplinary. I've learned a lot about chemistry and physics and what is being taught in those introductory courses. We have people in our fellowship who are mathematicians and statisticians. So we're really trying to understand how these disciplines all connect together. So why core ideas? Expert knowledge is organized into these underlying frameworks that reflects a deep understanding of the discipline. Okay, so we're experts. We have a deep understanding of our own disciplines. We have these building blocks that we use to create bigger structures. Right? So we start with the bricks, but we know as experts how to put those bricks together to tell a story, to build a building. Our students aren't always able to do that. So they have this pile of bricks. And if they don't have a framework onto which that, the scaffold onto which to put those bricks, you just get a pile of bricks. You don't tell the story, you can't build the building. And this is where we find from research that this is where a lot of our students are. They're not able to take those core ideas and understand the difference between what's a big idea and what's a little idea. And try to build these kinds of structures. So here's a definition of big ideas that I pulled from Wiggins and McTeague. Big ideas are important and enduring. They are transferable beyond the scope of a particular unit. Big ideas are the building material of understanding. They can be thought of as the meaningful patterns that enable one to connect the dots of otherwise fragmented knowledge. So instead of having all that pile of bricks, we start to build the building with big ideas. So I use the phrases big ideas and disciplinary core ideas interchangeably. Disciplinary core ideas is the term that the framework uses. So these are central to the discipline. They allow deep exploration of ideas. They help us get an organizational structure for the acquisition of new ideas, and they allow for generation of new ideas. And one of the ways I like to think about a big idea is that you can take a textbook from whatever discipline you're teaching, biology, chemistry, something in engineering, physics, math, whatever. If it's a big idea, you should be able to open that textbook to most pages and be able to identify it. Okay, so it's not a topic, it's not a chapter, it's something that permeates the entire discipline. So what are those? Well, one in biology is evolution, right? It all starts with evolution. So evolution is a big idea, and non-biologists can understand this. The cellular basis of life. It's a big idea that you can find examples of this or how it is a big idea in examples in textbook, in any part of the textbook. The intro part, the middle part, the end part. Chemistry, bonding and interactions. Molecular structure predicts macroscopic properties. These are things as you move through a chemistry curriculum you come back to constantly. They're not a topic, they're not a chapter, they're the essence of the discipline. In physics, we talk about momentum is conserved, or interactions cause changes in motion. Even with my very limited understanding of physics, I can see where this would be a big idea that permeates the entire discipline. So these are just some examples. It's not the full list. We do have a list to show you on the purple pages for a few disciplines, for physics, chemistry, and biology, because that's the type of folks who are involved in this project. Other disciplinary organizations, so I know physiology, for example, they have their own set of core ideas, which is actually very similar to the list that we've been using. Biochemistry has some, and ABET goes about it a little bit differently, but in engineering you can try to apply this to ABET and starting to think about what those core ideas are. So we know that this knowledge must be linked and contextualized. So when students are learning, they're not just learning those bricks. We want to think about how they can put it all together. And all of it starts with their prior knowledge. We know from the science of learning that new knowledge is built upon our existing knowledge. So we have to account for prior knowledge, then that is linked to new knowledge, and then how are we moving forward for students to learn new things. All of this must be linked and contextualized, and we need to think about it in the big picture and not just a particular topic, because that's not how learning actually works. So the core ideas should be developed over time. These are called learning progressions, and there's a lot of research on this. And we're not suggesting that all of you here be focused on developing learning progressions, but we just want you to keep this in mind in thinking about your courses. That there is this body of research that is showing us that students have to revisit these ideas over time, and that they have to build that new knowledge. Research-based descriptions of how students build knowledge and gain more expertise within and across a core idea over a broad span of time. So that's what researchers are trying to do, and we need to think about how we can, as practitioners, take advantage of that research, and we think that this approach, this three-dimensional learning approach, is one way to do that. So that's it about core ideas for right now. And one thing I'll mention, and I think it's in another slide in a little bit, we had projects to develop these core ideas here at MSU that went on for a long time, that engaged a lot of faculty in thinking and reiterating and negotiating what they are. It's not something that you would necessarily come up with in a one-hour workshop, okay? So we want you to try to see if you can use the ones that we've supplied, or if there's one that you know just jumps out at you from your own discipline. But this is something that to really develop the core ideas in your discipline, you'd want to go back and forth with your colleagues on. Okay, so that's core ideas. But we want to say that this content knowledge, even if it's conceptual understanding, is not enough. What we want to think about how we want students to use this information. And one of the ways we've been thinking about it is these scientific and engineering practices. Science is not just a body of knowledge that reflects current understanding of the world. It is also a set of practices used to establish, extend, and refine that knowledge. Both elements, knowledge and practice are essential. So really the idea here is that you can have conceptual knowledge, but if you can't use it in the context of scientific practices or engineering practices, then what good is that conceptual knowledge? The students need to be able to use it. So the framework articulates these practices. And what we often think about this, the way many of us think about this is inquiry. This is, it could be previously known as inquiry-driven, things like that. So asking questions and defining problems. So in number one, we can see the scientific practice, asking questions separated from the engineering practice, defining problems. Developing and using models. Planning and carrying out investigations and designing solutions, the latter part being an engineering practice. So now I'm nervous because Melanie's here. So it's okay. Using mathematics and computational thinking, developing explanations and designing solutions, engaging in argument from evidence, and lastly, obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. So these are all included in the handouts. So you're not expected to know those, but we're going to use them as we go forward today. So that's where we want to think about what the students are doing. How are they using those concepts? How are they using the big ideas? And the third dimension in the three-dimensional learning are cross-cutting concepts. So these are important themes that pervade science, mathematics, and technology and appear over and over again, whether we are looking at an ancient civilization, the human body, or a comet. They are ideas that transcend disciplinary boundaries and prove fruitful in explanation in theory, in observation, and in design. And part of this, the way we're thinking about it for this project, is we have this gateway series of courses that our students take. Why do they have to take chemistry, biology, physics? What are the cross-cutting concepts that connect these disciplines? And those are the courses taken by engineering students, science students, regardless of college. We are trying to better understand how we can create a coherent gateway experience for our students. And one way is to focus and think about these cross-cutting concepts. So what are those? Things like patterns, identifying and seeing patterns, cause and effect, scale, proportion, and quantity, systems thinking and using system models, energy and matter conservation, cycles and flows. So if we go back and we look at those big ideas from those other disciplines, we see energy coming up over and over again. Structure, function, stability, and change. So a lot of these have overlap just with a cross-cutting concept, but they also have overlap with core ideas within the disciplines. We can't always separate these into discrete categories, but we can see that these are the types of things that permeate the disciplines. So if we blend all of these things together, then we get what we call three-dimensional teaching and learning. And that's what we're trying to aim for in our efforts, and that's what this workshop is really focused on, is applying backward design to three-dimensional learning. So where do we start? So I'm only going to talk for a few more minutes, and then we'll have other people talk, and then we'll put you to work. So we want to think about how we can create learning objectives that include science practices and big ideas. For the sake of simplicity today, we are going to focus on just the two dimensions. What we have found is that if you focus on those two dimensions, the third dimension often comes along anyway. And it's been easier for us to define and to provide criteria to think about what is a science practice. And so if we start here, we're thinking about how can we really engage our students in learning these core ideas and applying them to science practices. So we want to think about what is the big idea in your course, what is a practice that you can engage the student in, and creating a learning objective that embodies that. So one of the big ideas, and we saw it was also a cross-cutting concept in biology, is structure function. So you can open any page of any textbook in any biology textbook and talk about structure function. So this is a lipid bilayer. That's at the beginning of the book usually, right? Structure function. We get to cells and cell type. We see a neuron compared to a lymphocyte. You can talk about how the structure of the cell dictates its function in the body. Then you can go all the way up to the organism. And I don't know anything about birds, but I can look at these birds and tell that they have different structure beaks, and then those different beaks are related to how they find their food and what type of food they eat. So going all the way from the molecular to the organismal level, we can look at structure function, and we can go beyond that, even the organismal level, go on to ecosystems. So that's a big idea in the discipline. So what do students do with this big idea? Okay, how can they apply this big idea? We don't just want them to be able to say the structure determines the function and give an example. We want them to really build on it and use it using these science practices. So one of the learning objectives that most of us who teach introductory cell and molecular biology have, we take structure function plus the modeling science practice, and we come up with this learning objective that says, draw a molecular level model of a phospholipid bilayer and use it to predict the ability of a given molecule to travel through the membrane. Okay? So it's not just drawing and labeling a membrane. That's what I used to ask my students to do. It's taking it a next step. What are they going to do with that picture that they've drawn? And how are they going to use it to apply the knowledge that we're hoping that they learn? So that's an example of blending or combining the structure function with this modeling science practice. Now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague in chemistry. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I'm going to do physics. Yeah, I'm going to try to do physics because we don't have any physicists here. Yes?
For that last objective, how would you, I guess, evaluate that in terms of, like, they drew the structure function but couldn't predict the ability, like, how much of that is worth 100 points, how many points is drawing the picture versus?
Yeah. So after we do learning objectives, I'll provide an example of an assessment using that, but it comes down to a partial credit issue, right? So they get some credit for being able to draw the figure and talk about the figure, and that's important. You need to be able to do that. We need to know stuff, but then if they can't apply it, then they're not meeting the learning objective. So we'll see examples of that. So our physicists, one is teaching and one is at a conference. So we'll give it a try. So the big idea here, and they have a list of big ideas, and this is an abbreviated statement of it. Interactions cause changes in motion, and they do a lot of work around models in the introductory physics courses. And so one of their learning objectives is use a microscopic model of matter, specifically the ball and spring, model to explain macroscopic phenomena including tension, compression, speed of sound in materials, and friction. Okay? So this is a broad learning objective, and later in the session we'll see the assessment that is associated with it. And now I will hand it over to Lynn Marie. Let me get the microphone.
Okay, so I've got an example of a learning objective that combines the core idea of change in stability in chemical systems. And just so you know what we're talking about with this big idea, the articulation statement for this core idea is energy and entropy changes, the rates of competing processes, and the balance between opposing forces govern the fate of chemical systems. So this is a core idea that relates to rates of reaction and chemical equilibrium. And we can combine that with the scientific practice of constructing explanations and engaging in argument from evidence to come up with a learning objective that is related to the Le Chatelier's principle type problems that are pretty typical in general chemistry. Our learning objective, once we throw in the scientific practices, we're going to ask students not only to predict what happens when we perturb a system at equilibrium, but why it happens. So explain why adding or removing components of a chemical system at equilibrium perturbs the position of equilibrium, and then to predict the effect of that equilibrium.
All right. That's a quick handoff.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to put you to work. So your task is to select a big idea from the discipline most closely related to the work that you do from here, or if you really have a big idea already in mind, feel free to use that. Again, this is the point I was talking about earlier, that identifying big ideas is an iterative process. It requires negotiation with colleagues. It's not something you can do in the time frame of a workshop like this, but that's why we suggest using these existing ones or something that you already have in mind. What we'd like you to try to do is to develop a learning objective that requires students to apply their understanding of the big idea using a science practice, and those science practices are listed in this handout as well. Okay, if you brought assessment items, because the abstract suggested that you could bring assessment items that you want to improve, you could use that as a starting point. And you could think about what is there a big idea associated with this assessment? What was the learning objective that I had in mind when I developed this? And if it doesn't include a big idea, if it doesn't include a science practice, how would I think about changing that learning objective to include both of those things? So as I mentioned, we have a whole bunch of people here, so please ask for help as you're doing this if you need it, or if you just want to bounce an idea off. But we'll give you some time to do that before we move on to assessments. Any questions? If you can find someone, you can start off individually and then you want to talk to your neighbors, or if you just want to start working in groups, that's fine too. So if you need to find someone in your discipline, raise your hand and we can help you find someone too. Okay. All right, it sounds like there's good conversation. We'll have time for a little more, but we want to wrap things up for a moment. Okay, who developed an amazing learning objective that they'd like to share with the group? And we have to make sure that we pass the microphone around to you so that we can hear it on the recording. I've been teaching for 12 years. I have an extensive wait time. Nobody developed one? All right. Thank you, John.
So we're talking about biology, and we actually kind of mix in a couple probably core ideas having to do with structure and function.
Can you just speak up in the back, because that's not actually working.
Sorry, okay.
So, yeah.
So we're working in biology, and we probably mix in a couple of core ideas having to do with structure and function, and also evolution. And so the actual learning objective we came up with doesn't include the evolution, but we did talk about it as part of this. So the idea is create a model of a protein interacting with a small molecule that explains why the protein interacts specifically with that small molecule with a certain affinity. So that's what we came up with.
So what is the practice is modeling?
The practice is modeling.
And the big idea is?
Structure, function in protein. And I suppose explanation gets put in there too. Sometimes modeling and explanation
Absolutely.
get
Yeah,
stuck together.
There's a lot of overlap. Good. Other examples? It's good to hear these examples because it helps us understand what's going on in other people's courses and what the students are getting. Nobody else? Okay, thank you. Could you pass that back, please, Adele? Thank you.
So we have three very different disciplines here, and I just wanted to say that we laid the gauntlet down of merging our different disciplines in a way, which made it actually really hard, and I thought actually pushed me to think a lot more than I would have if I had just thought about my own, because I've got all the examples of my own. So we're not happy, I think, yet with where we're at, but I found it exciting to think about animal nutrition and then evolutionary stress, and sort of what we were working along the lines of, and I'm trying to paraphrase for the two experts, is basically that there's a microbiome dependence. There's a system that cows depend upon to eat and digest. And what happens if antibiotics are introduced to different populations of cows?
Okay. Okay. So what do you think would be a big idea there, and what would be the practice?
So I think systems is the big idea, because you have the microbiome system in the gut. And then the practice was tricky because we were thinking like we could just have students experiment with it and look at feces and look at how the gut microbiome changed by sequencing it. Okay. So, but that kind of was blended with assessment. Right. You see what I mean? Like separating practice and assessment. We were trying to figure that out. So.
Yeah, and so a lot of times these also often overlap too. So I could think of an assessment and a learning objective that involves asking questions, the first science practice, sort of what you alluded to there. Then also looking at the data and analyzing the data. So there might not just be one single thing, but you could think about how you would use that big idea to engage students in multiple science practices potentially. Adele, do you want to share one too?
So I was solo, kind of. I did it by myself, but I do this throughout my course, so in different systems. So I teach physiology, and it's use the accepted model of regulation of blood pressure, or it could be regulation of body fluid compartments. It could be different systems, and predict the effect, and this is of a drug that constricts arterioles, or it could be a drug that increases blood pressure. So it's use of a model to make predictions. It's the big idea is cause and effect, and it's also systems.
Great, 3 dimensions, okay. All right, so yeah, Sharif.
So the big idea is about the molecular basis of disease.
Okay.
So the aim or the goal, the student would be able to explain how physiology is disturbed on molecular level to cause a disease.
Okay.
And the assessment or the, like I thought about something like maybe like imaginary, like to ask him, if you imagine we got to have a nano robot that will go to the cell to correct something in the molecular level to cure the disease.
Okay.
What's the orders you will give to this nano robot so he will be able to correct the
Okay, so so you're thinking about how you would engage students in this science practice and how they might learn it and they might assess it. Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Becky Matz now.
Can I see that?
This is just a couple slides.
Just real quick before we move on, I wanted to put in a quick plug for the fellowship because Corey mentioned there's a new NSF use grant that our group got, and part of what that grant is going to do is support a few more cohorts of what we have been calling the STEM Gateway Fellowship. It's kind of getting rebranded as the STEM Teaching and Learning Fellowship. But essentially, if you're enjoying what you're doing here today and you'd like to get paid for it and have lunch over about 2 years, you can be on the lookout for the call that's going to come out in the spring. So there's going to be about 3 more cohorts over the next 5 years, 4 or 5 years, of basically doing this, but in a really deep, extended way, and we read papers together, and we use real course materials and implement them and all that kind of stuff. So if you're interested, there's money and food that comes with it. Super fun. So this is not actually on, or it is on. Is this just for the recording? Oh, it's so weird. Okay, so you've identified like a desired result in this learning objective for students, or you've kind of gotten your way there, and you might have already started thinking about, as you were saying, about assessments, but we're going to kind of move a little bit more concertedly into the assessment piece of this. So we're going to figure out what evidence would you accept what would you accept as evidence of student mastery or of student progress towards this objective. So our group developed this thing called the 3D LAP, 3-dimensional learning assessment protocol. And this protocol or tool is basically a way for us to look at an assessment item and go, yeah, we think that reflects the practice, this practice, or not that practice. Yes, we think this reflects a core idea, yes or no. And yes, we think this practice or this assessment item reflects a cross-cutting concept, yes or no. So it's essentially a set of criteria. The reference is up here, and we can help you find it if you like, but there's references to it on many of the materials. So it's basically a set of criteria for each of those practices and cross-cutting concepts and core ideas. So it was a way for us across, and again, only particular to biochemistry and physics, but a way for us to look at those assessment items and say, yeah, we think those reflect modeling, we think those reflect analyzing and interpreting data, these don't, and here's why. So basically what it consists of, for example, for the practice developing and using models, and as a side note, for the practices, we developed sort of similar but different sets of criteria for constructed response items and also for selected response items. You can see those in the white handout there. But this is what the criteria look like for this one practice. So there's like a little description of developing and using models, as there is for all the other practices. And then there's these criteria underneath.
And these criteria were developed through looking at lots and lots and lots of existing assessment items, through developing new assessment items, and again doing this over a number of years and across these disciplines. So for developing and using models, what these criteria are, these are criteria that we basically require the assessment item has to meet all 4 of them in order for us to code it as a, yeah, that's a developing and using models question. So just real quick, if we go back to the biology learning objective that, that Corey had put up before, draw a molecular level model of a phospholipid bilayer and use it to predict the ability of a given molecule to travel through it. An example assessment item that we think does meet all these criteria is here. And this is pretty close to the actual learning objective, right? Even the language is pretty close to it. So it kind of depends, you know, what level you write your learning objectives at and all this kind of stuff. But so this is the item. Draw and label a diagram showing the molecular structure of the bilayer, and then predict the ability, or use the model to explain why carbon dioxide could go through, but a potassium ion couldn't. So just to real quickly go through the criteria, the situation, the event, the observation or phenomenon. Well, some things can go through this bilayer, but others can't. So we would call that the phenomenon, so we get a little check or a gold star for number 1. In this case, the students have to draw and label a diagram. So they're developing this representation, so we'd say, okay, that gets a check for number 2. This second question, or the second criterion, we allowed for those representations to be given, right? I mean, depending on the testing situation, how many students you have, exactly what class you're in, upper division, lower division, whatever. Sometimes it's not always practical for the students to be drawing their own graphs or representations or models. So we found that to be helpful, that the question could give the representation instead of asking the students to draw it. The question asks the students to explain why something happens, so the third criterion there. And then the fourth one is this reasoning component. That's basically the connection between the explanation that they wrote, which is the one for criterion 3, and then the representation. So the fourth criterion is basically, is there a connection between what the students did to fulfill the second criterion and the third criterion? So this is a constructed response example, and John has a selected response example. And there you go.
All right, so we don't all have the luxury of being able to grade lots of free response questions for all of the objectives we want to get the students to do. And so we want to try as best as possible, in some cases, to do selected response questions that try to get to the same ideas. And so we're going to take that same learning objective, and the criteria for selected responses are similar but not quite the same. So it's going to give an event, observation, or phenomena. So that's pretty much the same. But in this case, it gives a representation and asks the students to select a representation. So here, clearly, the students are not going to draw on a selected response. And then it asks the students to select an explanation. So you're giving them choices of explanations or a prediction about that event, observation, phenomena. And then finally, as part of that choice, they have to be making decisions about the reason why that explanation or prediction would be correct. Right. So we're going to jump back and forth here between this selected response question and those criteria. So we have 2 different models of a membrane here. So presumably, if they were able to draw an accurate model of the membrane, they could select which of these 2 would be the accurate model. So in the question, we're going to be asking them to select either model 1 or model 2 as the correct model. And so then it said, the question itself says, shown above are 2 different molecular models of the membrane. Which model accurately depicts the structure of the mitochondrial inner membrane and explains why protons are unable to pass through this membrane? So if we go back to the criteria, it gives a question is about an event, the fact that protons are unable to pass through this membrane. It gives them representations and asks them to select one of those representations. So the next 2 criteria, select an explanation In this case, we're asking them to select an explanation, and then there's some reasoning about the representation linking back to the model. So the choices here, 2 of the choices, they're choosing model 1. 2 of the choices are model 2. So they have to select either model 1 or model 2. And then if we look at the choices, in a way, they're parallel with the model 1. In one case, we say that the hydrophobic tails make it unfavorable for that positive charge to get through. In the other case, we say there's some kind of ionic interaction between the positive charge on the proton and the phosphate head groups, which are making so that it doesn't pass through, right? And then the same thing essentially with model 2. So they're selecting which model, and they're selecting the actual reason why that proton, and yes, for the chemists, we know protons don't really exist, but in biology, we talk about them all the time. Why that proton can't go through that membrane. So this is an example of trying to get at some of the same things that you would get in a selected response, or in a free response that you use in a selected response. Now, there's a question earlier, and so if it's okay, I'm going to take just a little bit of time to address it. So in a selected or in a free response, you can weight those things differently, right? With the selected response, this is however many points this thing was worth, and it's all or nothing, right? So we've played around with trying to do kind of a series of questions. The problem with that becomes oftentimes they'll snowball in ways that if they selected the wrong thing first, their logic might actually be correct in the second and third one, but they're getting them wrong. So there's real difficulty with doing this well. And so this, I think, is probably where we've come up with what we're working with now. That's not to say this can't get better, and hopefully over time we'll figure out better ways to do this. But this is kind of the effort or the place we're at in terms of trying to do this. So, yes.
For this one, could you even say which ones are worth, the correct answer is for full credit if you got half of it right?
You know, depending on how you're scoring these, and I think if you're using the scoring office, they don't have that kind of flexibility, but sometimes with computer programs, there are these models where you're giving partial credit for answers that are more correct than other answers. There's also some research on multiple select, where they're given a series of statements and they have to choose all of them that are actually accurate, and so you can get partial credit that way. I have not actually I've played around with that with clicker questions as sort of formative assessment in class. But I've not done it on exams, in part because the scoring office won't deal with that, so I haven't put a lot of effort into that.
Can I give you a microphone?
So what about you were talking about a series, and it's tough because if they get the first question wrong, they could get the rest wrong. What about, so I teach a large class, so I use scratch-offs, and I have found that using a series that way works, because then they see the right answer at some point before they move on.
So if you're not familiar with the idea of scratch-offs, you can buy these, they look like a Scantron, but you scratch it off, and you know before what the right answer for each question is. So question 1, the right answer might be C. Question 2, the right answer might be A. And what the students do is they scratch off their initial answer, and you know if you got it right or not because there's only one thing scratched off. But then they know they got it wrong when they scratch it off, and they can keep scratching until they find the right answer. So if you're using that model, in fact, they could get the first question wrong, but then they keep scratching until they get the right answer, and then they can build from the right answer for the next one. So that would be a solution, a potential solution to this problem with snowballing in multiple selected response questions. Yeah. Well, so those are. So the question is, are those scratch-offs scorable by the scoring office? And I don't believe that they are. But this is where if you have an undergrad, the undergrads can very quickly go through and score these things.
But I actually have my students grade themselves.
Yeah.
And so I just have the LAs check to make sure that.
Yeah, so you could actually have the students, because it's pretty obvious they got it right or wrong, so they can go through and self-score and give a score at the bottom, and the LAs can just flip through and make sure that the totals are correct. So there are ways around the scoring off. There's lots of solutions to these if you're creative about it. So.
But then doesn't that end up the professors writing a very extensive exam or problem set, because you don't want each step to be such a huge chunk of the grade? So, yes, you got, A is not equal to 5, you move on to
Right. So the question has to do with then if you actually have to have a long series of questions to perhaps get to it. And yeah, so I don't know how far we want to go down these because yeah, how do you design these things to really get to what you want and manage it within those situational constraints? Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's basically probably very situation specific. So.
Well, I was just going to say that one of the things that we've done is write clusters of multiple choice questions where they're all about the same phenomenon, but the answer for the first one does not predicate the answer to the second one. So they're about different aspects. So the one that comes to mind is, you know, they will do a calculation about reaction energies, and then there's a graph that they need to develop or choose, but it doesn't have to be predicated on the answer to the first one, but it's about the same thing, so that they can get one right without getting the first wrong.
Okay, so back to a chemistry example. So this is going to take a little bit different approach to actually writing three-dimensional questions. So I'm going to start with an existing question because it's often fruitful to start with what you already have. So this is a typical question from general chemistry. So we have an acid ionization reaction of carbonic acid, and student would be asked to predict the effect or actually what perturbation would cause an increase in the hydronium ion concentration. And it turns out both answers 2 and 3 would increase the hydronium ion concentration. This question doesn't include a scientific practice. It also doesn't address a core idea, because students can answer this question using the heuristic that, you know, if you, in this case, add the product, or actually you want to increase the product, you've got to add reactant to shift equilibrium toward products. And so the students can answer this question without understanding why. So they tell you what happens, but not why it happens. So if we go back to the learning objective that it introduced before, the idea of combining change in stability in chemical systems with constructing explanations or engaging in argument from evidence, the key here in our learning objective was explaining why adding or removing components are going to perturb the equilibrium, and then and also to predict the effect of perturbing that equilibrium. So an example of a constructed response question it's based on that original question, but we've now asked this first question to get students thinking about what the condition is for chemical equilibrium at the molecular level. The idea that rates of forward and reverse reactions are balanced at equilibrium. And then in the second, so we're trying to sort of prompt them to be thinking in the right, the way we'd like them to be thinking about starting their explanation. And then we specifically asked in the second question to have them address what's happening to reaction rates, to explain why adding sodium bicarbonate is going to shift equilibrium to the left, favoring reactants. And what we're after, and it never hurts to guide students to what you're looking for, we want them to be talking about what's happening at the molecular level, and in particular the fact that increasing the concentration of sodium bicarbonate is going to increase the number of collisions between products in this reaction. And there's also the little don't restate Le Chatelier's principle, because if you don't put that there, students will just give you back Le Chatelier's principle. So this is one way of taking that original question and recrafting it so that it really gets at a scientific practice, is asking students for not only what happens, but why it happens. this kind of question can be given in our large enrollment general chemistry class, and we do some constructed response questions in Chemistry 141 and 142. But we also have to, just because of the numbers, we also do selected response. So here's an example of the same basic question that has been formatted as selected response. So we've divided it, it's divided into two parts. The first part is the what happens. So how does the composition of the system change as it returns to equilibrium following the addition of sodium bicarbonate? So students get to choose from the two responses about what's happening to the relative concentrations of reactants and products. And then the second part asks them the why. So they would select, they'd make a prediction about what happens in the first part, and then the second part they would select the best explanation for what's happening. And what we're after is we want them to be thinking about how increasing the number of collisions, which accompanies increasing concentration, will increase the rate of the reaction. So in this case, more collisions between the products will increase the rate of the reverse reaction.
Any questions about that approach?
And I would just say, I mean, it could seem somewhat intimidating to, you know, the prospect of starting totally from scratch to write three-dimensional questions. But often if you look at what you already have, there are questions you've already been asking that have the potential to be expanded upon to incorporate scientific practices.
So we were going to spend time having you work on these, but now our workshops are only going to one, so we don't have time. So I thought I'd open it up to questions. Questions about this approach, questions about developing these types of assessments. We explained everything so well, you're all ready to go use this. Okay, so we hope, I did have a physics example there, but I'm not even going to try. So we hope that you got to achieve some level of these objectives that we had for you today. Anybody here that's on the team would be happy to sit down and talk about this, to go over examples from your class. This is sort of an institutional effort. It's not just the folks within our group. Becky talked about the fellowship that we'll be sending announcements out for next semester. We really want to try to get everyone to think about this and think about how they might change their courses to make sure our students are being engaged in science and engineering practices and maybe in some other practices depending on your discipline. One of the things that we noticed from the fellowship is that we have folks who teach calculus, for example, and the practices that they use are a little bit different. They're developing their own definitions of practices as they participate in this fellowship. And the great thing is the rest of us are learning about it in the process. We're learning about what's happening in those math courses that all of our students take. So, please think about the fellowship, but also reach out to any one of us. If you want to reach out directly to me, I can connect you with somebody in your discipline too. Okay, all right, well, thank you very much for coming. We will have another series of workshops beginning in January, same day, same time, and as soon as we have that finalized, we'll start publicizing it. Have a good holiday.